Lovely. So, as our official voice of the internet has just informed us, we are recording this session. So if you don't want your face to be seen, turn your camera off. And also the entreaty that we always put out there to please remember to keep yourself mic'd unless you're speaking so we don't get the background noise happening. And now a proper welcome, having done the internet side of warnings and so on. Welcome to the Guild of St. George and to the latest in our series of themed online talks by our companions, which we began to hold about a year ago in response to lockdown. I'm Dr. Rachel Dickinson, and I'm the master or chair of Ruskin's Guild of St. George. And for those of you who may not know anything about the Guild, just really briefly, it was founded by John Ruskin in 1871. So we're celebrating our 150th this year. And it was designed to bring like-minded individuals, companions, together to combat the negative effects of industrialization. Today, we're an educational charity with a focus on art, craft, and rural economy, as well as a range of linked areas that Ruskin addresses in a series of letters, public letters, called Fors Clavigeria. We have more than 300 companions or members from 15 countries, each of whom has joined the Guild with a unique perspective, their take on Ruskin and Ruskin's ideas and their continuing relevance. And so the online talks we've hosted have been as varied as Ruskin's writings. He was a polymath who wrote about just about anything you can imagine. He said something that relates to it. And these talks have reflected the wealth of knowledge and passion that our companions bring. They've included, for example, a reading group looking closely at some passages from Ruskin, drawing sessions led by one of our American companions, who's an artist, themed discussions featuring often trios of companions as tonight, talking about areas that they're passionate about, such as the ongoing refugee crisis, or most recently on technology. Looking ahead, we're about to launch a series of monthly reading groups looking at Ruskin on Venice, leading to an online day conference in the spring. And everyone here would be welcome to join either one-offs of those events or the final conference. And while Venice is the focus of that upcoming series, it is with the awareness that that city, so beloved by Ruskin and so enchanting, is actually representative of global issues. And so even when we're drilling down to think specifically about Venice, we're also thinking about global issues such as pollution that we're dealing with more overtly today. The Guild is its companions, and each speaker presents their own personal perspective. So today's session, in effect, continues that thread with a focus on pollution. And we have three distinguished companions to guide our thoughts in relation to this. Michelle Lovric is going to go first, then David Barrie and Chris Baines. Each of them will say a few words to introduce themselves, so I'm not going to introduce them except by saying their name, and their unique perspective on pollution, and then they'll each speak for about 10 minutes. After all three have spoken, we'll then have a chance for them to respond to each other, but also for the rest of us in the room to raise questions and comments and have a dialogue together. We will aim, as always, to end as punctually as we can at 6:30. But before handing over to our first speaker, I want to very briefly set the context in terms of Ruskin. After all, my day job is as an academic. I'm a reader in interdisciplinary studies in the English department at Manchester Metropolitan University, with a specialism in Ruskin and indeed the long 19th century. John Ruskin was a Victorian who wrote in response to what he saw around him, the beautiful, the puzzling, and the horrific. And pollution was one of the areas he specifically addressed. With the keen eye of both a scientist and an artist, he noted the effects of industrialization on the sky, seeing what he called the storm cloud of the 19th century, both literally and figuratively. And in 1879, he wrote of experiencing a storm at his Coniston home in the Lake District, which transported Manchester's devil's darkness. Remember, this was Cottonopolis, the heart of industrialization, transported that into the rural lakes, where he writes, "The air became one loathsome mass of sultry and foul fog like smoke." He doesn't specifically use the term pollution here, and in fact, he rarely uses it in his writing, but he does a little bit. For example, in 1867, he wrote to his mother from Keswick while he was traveling there, and he said, "I am content here with the roadside hedges and streams, and this contentment is the great thing for health. And there is hardly anything to annoy me of absurd or calamitous human doing, but still the ancient cottage life, very rude and miserable enough in its torpor, but clean and calm, not a vile cholera and plague of bestilled pollution like back streets of London." He recognized that pollution was not simply from the urban pressures of living in close proximity, but was directly linked to industry. Notably, in 1875, he wrote of water, saying, "Our manufacturers have still left, in some parts of England and Scotland, streams of what may be advertised in the bills of natural scenery as real water. And I myself know several so free from pollution that one can sit near them with perfect safety, even when they are not in flood." But we must remember that for Ruskin, pollution was related both to physical impurity or contamination and to spiritual or moral corruption. He wrote elsewhere of how a man might but cast from him as pollution all that is proud and artificial and unquiet and worldly, and possess his soul in humility and peace. Pollution can be traced in the destruction of the natural world and in the dehumanization of people. Either way, it's a negative effect brought about by human action. Ruskin calls on us as individuals to do what we can to undo that harm. And so I'm going to turn first to Michelle Lovric to introduce herself and begin to direct our thoughts to the continuing problem of pollution. Michelle, over to you.
Thank you. My name is Michelle Lovric. I am a novelist, a poet, a teacher, and a campaigner, and I live in London and Venice, which is the subject of my talk. So I'm just going to share my screen now. And now I can start from the beginning. Sometimes I think we companions use Ruskin as shorthand for everything we know to be good, or shorthand for outrage against everything bad. Guided by Ruskin's tenets, I've spent the last 2 years in a state of outrage. It's because of the way that the River Thames is run and the way the waters of Venice are run. The result is filthy air, deadly water, tormented and dispossessed citizens. I call these the liquid iniquities. First, London. The River Thames is run on a charter that dates to 1909. This allows the Port of London Authority to do whatever it sees fit, so long as it raises its own revenues and doesn't trouble the exchequer. If it gets wet, the PLA can charge money for it. The PLA's charter was drawn up when London hosted a vast imperial and foreign trade, so it's drastically out of date. A few small revisions have mostly removed expensive duties. These include responsibility for air, light, water, and noise pollution. This charter leaves the Thames in trouble. Thames boats run on crudely refined marine diesel, the worst fuel in London. It's rich in particulates and sulfur. Air pollution takes 9,000 lives a year in London. But the mayor's power over London's air stops at the foreshore. The river belongs to the PLA. So the ultra-low emission zone has a gaping lacuna exactly where London's pollution is the worst. Cold water amplifies noise. The Thames soundscape and nightscape are now dominated by a dozen floating nightclubs that encourage behavior which would never be tolerated on land. This includes unspeakable noise, strobe lights that hurt marine life, indecent behavior, screaming, stabbing, Nazi salutes. If you live on the river, you see it all. In 1989, 51 people died when the Bow Bell dredger ploughed over the Marchioness party boat. The final report states that the skipper probably never heard the 4 warnings about the Bow Bell because the music was too loud. And yet nothing's ever been done to curb the raging party boats. The PLA sees the floating nightclubs as clients. How do I know all of this? Well, it's a bit of a horror story. In March 2019, a neighbour sent me a blog about historic Swan Lane Pier. It was going to be restored. Lovely, I thought, imagining day trips to Margate, a canoe club, but something made me check out the planning application. This was due to be waved through as a small project under delegated powers by a planning officer in just a couple of days. In the fine print, I found a document called the Operational Manual of the Ocean Diva. Ocean Diva? It sounded big and blingy. I started to look into it. I discovered that the plan was to bring to London the biggest and ugliest party boat in Europe. This Dutch boat's a Frankenstein made from a Cold War cruise ship cut in half. It's 282 feet long, bigger than a football pitch, 3 stories high, takes 1,500 partygoers. It would block out historic views all along the Thames. Parties like this are the Ocean Diva's thing. And lighting like this. The Ocean Diva also planned to sail luxury cars and even small planes down the river for sales extravaganzas. The Thames would be commodified as an advertising backdrop. Worse, to make an underwater harbour for the Ocean Diva, they'd excavate 2,200 cubic metres of contaminated sediment, too toxic even to be disposed of at sea. Digging it up could mean leakage, diffusion, and so death to wildlife. The Ocean Diva's owners had discovered a massive loophole. Because it floats, the Ocean Diva didn't need to go through the planning system. All they needed was the PLA's support. The PLA refutes freedom of information. So we found another way. Under Environmental Information Regulations 2004, they couldn't keep ignoring our questions. Through the redactions, it emerged that the PLA and the Ocean Diva had been quietly working together for years to bring the boat to the Thames, a goldmine for the Ocean Diva, and every journey down the river would be a bonanza for the PLA. The City of London councillors, police, cleansing departments had been kept in the dark about exactly what would be sitting at the rebuilt Swan Lane Pier. So had all local residents and businesses. There'd been zero consultation. The planning officer said, "This is just about a pier, nothing to see here, move along." Not a single CGI showed the Ocean Diva. Everywhere the Ocean Diva would be, the images just faded to white. Next, we looked into Ocean Diva London Shipping Limited. The directors, Edwin Peterson, the boat's owner, and a Mr. Robert Dwan. That's when we knew we were really in trouble. Robert Dwan's the son of Keith Dwan, master of the Company of Lightermen and Watermen, the people who work the river. All the Thames vested interests were deeply invested in the Ocean Diva. That was the end of my life as a novelist for nearly 2 years. I guess all environmental campaigns are the same. They burn you up, but you know that if you stop, big business money will just fill the vacuum. For another talk are stories of how we lawyered up, how business, residents, Southwark Cathedral, the Royal Palaces and the Globe all joined forces, how we reached out to the people of Amsterdam to tell for the truth about the Ocean Diva, how a writer friend set up a petition, but for now, just a few quick images. We got permission from No Grandi Navi in Venice to adapt their logo for the Thames. We worked with new companion, Deirdre Kelly, to make this campaign image. We made sure the Guardian, the Telegraph and Evening Standard outed the Ocean Diva's designs on London. And we tapped into social media with cats and even armadillos. Meanwhile, the planning officer delayed releasing a crucial police report and steered the application towards refusal on a tiny single technicality, which would be easy to change and then appeal. Outed, the Ocean Diva next claimed to be building a new electric boat with a cocktail of incompatible tech. They spent a fortune buying expert reports to state that the Ocean Diva would have no more impact on the Thames than a seagull. The electric boat was never built, of course. I won't keep you in suspense. On the day of the committee, the City of London councillors showed that they'd listened. They stood up one after another to denounce the project for its sneakiness, its unwholesomeness, and its greed. They expanded the grounds for refusal. The Thames can breathe for a while. But because of the Thames loopholes, this could happen again at any time. The same vested interests are still aligned. There's still a vast lacuna where the Conservancy of the Thames should be. The PLA will dart towards lucrative projects because it doesn't have to deal with the environmental consequences. What conservancy is the PLA doing? A few rather tokenistic competitions, a lot of conferences, a lot of Thames visions, a lot of virtue signalling. It claims it's making its own fleet electric, but its own fleet is tiny. And the PLA is welcoming in cruise ships, bringing them ever deeper into London. The PLA now wants a harbour revision order for their charter, an opportunity to address environmental issues, you'd think. No, there's no mention of emissions norms. Now to Venice. Everything I know about campaigning, I learned from No Grandi Navi in Venice. So a quick word about Venice, quick because the story's changing every minute. As of August the 1st, no ships over 25,000 tons are allowed into the Bacino or the Giudecca Canal. That's the blue route above here. There's compensation for cruise companies and port workers, but the big ships can still take the red route on the left to Marghera, and so bring their fumes, their raw sewage, their dangerous bulk into the lagoon's delicate ecosystem. For the cruise ships, there's a plan to deepen the Canal di Petrolio, where the petrochemical plants of Marghera dumped toxic effluent for nearly a century. There's a competition for a new cruise port project, but the same interessi who kept the cruise ships in Venice still have their hands out. They want their industrial banchina at Marghera done up at taxpayer expense for luxury cruise reception. How safe is that? And the sheer amount of money means that these projects would not be temporary, they'd last decades. The competition's just another delaying tactic to keep the Grandi Navi in the lagoon and to keep the money flowing into the pockets of the interessi who own land around the Marghera docks. Those people include Mayor Brugnaro. Two viable projects already exist, Duferco and Vielmo. Both involve floating pontoons outside the lagoon with electric boats bringing passengers into town, providing employment without emissions. The interessi don't like these two plans as they're extremely cheap. There's no traction on huge funds. We don't know what will happen yet. The interessi still smudge the horizon. While better than Marghera, Duferco and Vielmo could also still bring in 2 million tourists a year. In the meantime, here are some things we do know about the cruise ships in the lagoon. The new limit of 25,000 tons isn't dainty. The ships have names like Poesia and Melody, but there's no such thing as an aesthetically pleasing cruise ship. They're built to make brutal amounts of money, and that's how they look. Their vast ugliness managed to destroy Venice's beauty more than war or conquest. A large cruise ship's carbon footprint is worse than that of 12,000 cars. The Grandi Navi run their generators all night, filling the air with noise, filth, and light. Carless Venice has Europe's third most polluted port. The ships leave a trail of effluent. Their scrubbers take sulfur out of the air and rinse it into the water instead. Their wakes cause erosion and the continual resuspension of toxic sediment, diffusing poison through the lagoon. They displace water. We can't afford this. Mose, the supposed flood protection system, is not operational, decades late, rusting. Mose devoured 30% of all money coming into Venice, too much of it channeled into the pockets of the interessi while saving on inferior materials. The corruption scandal broke in 2014 and work is currently paused. Cruise collisions with marine animals take a murderous toll. Cruise ships bring invasive seaweeds and parasites into the lagoon. Sea life's endangered by the biocides they use to clean algae from their undersides. Cruise ships have no brakes. Here's the MSC Opera crashing into the Zatra in June 2019. We've had 2 accidents. The Canal di Petrolio saw a major incident 3 weeks ago because it's just too windy for tall ships. Another huge accident, just a matter of time. It took 3 years to drag the Costa Concordia away from the Isola del Giglio, where it capsized in 2012. Imagine 3 years of this in Venice, even with a 25,000-ton cruiser. Black air deletes art, just as it deletes life. Pollution turns marble to chalk, the next rain washes it away. Cruise labor practices are modern slavery. The ships register where tax is avoided and regulation is unenforceable. They're floating petri dishes for disease. COVID showed how they put profit ahead of safety, a risk to every passenger, crew member, and every they visited. Cruise ships clog the streets with sudden vast invasions of people who see a few top sights, leaving the smaller museums gasping for life. They bring very little revenue to Venice compared with the damage they do, just 3% of local gross domestic product, 280 million euros, but most of that goes to the interessi. It's not spent on conservation or the population whose lives are immiserated. Venetians are trapped inside their homes, while tourists are privileged in Venice's most glorious spaces. In this spatially orchestrated dispossession, Venice's culture and history are commodified to the extent that the Venetians are deprived of their own public realm. Few Venetians have gardens, so this hurts more. This is the Venetian counter at the Morelli pharmacy in Rialto. It's hovering at 50,000. There are more tourist beds than Venetians now. Venetians are leaving at the rate of 2 a day. 2/3 have left in the last 70 years. Would you stay in a city that Salvatore Settis, Italy's modern-day Ruskin, calls a commercialized carcass? Without honor, reverence, or tenderness, this is what you get in London or Venice, ships like this. Honor, reverence, and tenderness, key Ruskinian tenets. Italian writer Roberto Ferrucci imagined Ruskin at the Calcina Hotel, watching the grotesque prow of a cruise ship slice through Venice. For Ruskin's thoughts on cruise ships and crowding, we have his disgust with the railway bridge into Venice. He hated Venice's steamships, calling their whistles accursed. I only wish we had his words on the cruise ships and the liquid iniquities of the Thames and Venice. I was lunching at the Calcina 10 days ago when I saw this from my table. This is Venice's latest crime against herself. It's called cracking. Excess fuel burned straight into the air. It feels like suicide to me. Fragile Venice teeters on the brink. Salvatore Settis's book bears an ominous title, If Venice Dies. And the reason for the if in the title is this. If Venice dies, it won't be the only thing that dies. The very idea of the city as an open space where diversity and social life can unfold, as the supreme creation of our civilization, as a commitment to and promise of democracy, will also die with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. That nicely gets us thinking about the multi-layers of pollution and very much that sort of economic drive, which Ruskin also saw as being at the heart of so much of what is polluting. So with that note, David Barrie, can I turn to you to take us on to another thread of thinking about pollution?
Rachel, thank you. And Michelle, thank you for that powerful attack on the problems caused by the grandi navi, both in London and Venice. I heartily agree with everything you said. I'm going to be talking about light pollution. And I was trying to remember whether Ruskin had actually said anything much about it. And the only thing I could come up with was one of the Four's letters, letter number 46, where he talks about, I mean, appropriately enough, what members of St. George's Company, the Guild now, should do, what counts as good work. And he uses as a kind of model of good work the creation story in Genesis. And as you will, of course, recall, on the fourth day, God, to use Ruskin's words, established time and the seasons and the authority of the stars. And he goes on to say that one of the good works that members of the Guild should undertake is indeed the establishment of times and seasons. And I'm now quoting from Ruskin: the correspondent human work is a due watching of the rise and set of stars and course of the sun, and due administration and forethought of our own annual labors, preparing for them in hope and concluding them in joyfulness according to the laws and gifts of heaven, which beautiful order is set forth in symbols on all lordly human buildings round the semicircular arches, which are types of the rise and fall of days and years. And then he says, the corresponding diabolic work, this is where it comes to light pollution, the correspondent diabolic work is turning night into day with candles so that we never see the stars, and mixing the seasons up one with another, and having early strawberries and green peas and the like. Well, that was the nearest I could get to Ruskin sounding off about light pollution. And I suppose the reason for that is simple enough, which is that light pollution really wasn't a huge problem in the middle of the 19th century, though it was coming to be so. I've become more and more interested in light pollution through my work, because when I was researching Incredible Journeys, which is a book about the science of animal navigation, I came across many, many examples of the problems that are caused by human artificial light to our fellow creatures. There's a kind of technical term that's used for this kind of light. It's called ALAN, artificial light at night. And I might use that term as I go on. Now, the thing about light pollution, about ALAN, is that it's crept up on us. Very, very few people alive today can remember a time when the skies over London, for example, weren't deeply polluted by light. And the growth of ALAN has been so slow and gradual as to be almost imperceptible. And the result, I think, is that most people today are pretty much unaware of what they've lost. They've lost, of course, we've all lost, those of us who live in or near large cities particularly, we've lost the night sky, we've lost darkness. And when I say most of us, I do literally mean most of us, because today more than half the whole human population of this planet lives in and around cities. And the problem, in essence, is that artificial light at night, ALAN, in cities produces a huge dome of light above each city. And it produces a lot of reflected light that comes back from the sky above, which is known as sky glow. And this sky glow essentially occludes our view of the night sky. And that means, in practice, that most people have never seen the Milky Way. It's really rather an astonishing thought. The Milky Way, that was an integral part of everybody's sense of the night not so many years ago, has now become invisible to most of humanity. And the Milky Way, of course, is our home galaxy. When we look up at an unpolluted night sky and we see the ribbon of light that is the Milky Way, we're looking at the stars with which we share the galaxy that is our home. And in fact, some years ago, when an earthquake knocked out the power supply in Los Angeles, believe it or not, quite a lot of people called the emergency services, expressing alarm because they'd seen this strange river of light in the sky. And some of them said, is it an alien invasion? What's going on? They were completely astonished and in some cases frightened by this unfamiliar apparition. But of course, until early in the 20th century, an unpolluted night sky filled with thousands and thousands of stars was part of everyone's birthright. Today, it's only in relatively remote places, mountains and on the open sea, that we can enjoy what I think is quite literally the most sublime spectacle that nature can offer us, a view of half the visible universe. A truly awesome sight. And we're cut off, therefore, from a spectacle that has shaped mythology, it's shaped religion, it's shaped literature, and of course, science. You know, a dark night sky. And that is a terrible rupture. We are, in a sense, cut off from the deep past of our own species. But we humans, who are the cause of this problem, are, I'm afraid, suffering far less than other animals. I can only give a few brief examples, but let's just consider for a moment migratory birds, many of which fly at night, partly because it's cooler. And they rely to quite a large extent on the stars to provide them with their sense of direction. So plainly, if the stars are hidden from them, they're going to have a problem navigating, and they may go astray. And worse still, brightly lit buildings in cities dazzle them, and literally millions, tens of millions of migratory birds die every year in collisions with lighted buildings. It's a holocaust of birds. Insects too suffer terribly. Nocturnal insects are drawn in their billions to artificial lights, where they beat themselves to death or fall victim to predators like bats that have learned that going to street lamps and other bright lights is a very good way of finding dinner. Looking now at marine creatures, sea turtles are also faced with grave problems because of Allen. When little turtles hatch from the egg and attempt to get to the sea, which is essential for them if they're going to survive, they are drawn naturally towards a horizon that is slightly brighter than other parts of the horizon. And in the old days, it was a pretty safe bet that the horizon over the sea would be a bit brighter than the horizon over the land. But of course, with artificial light, that situation has in many places been reversed, and turtle hatchlings in their tens of thousands die every year because they are drawn to the artificial lights rather than finding their way successfully to the sea. More generally, artificial light has the effect of disturbing absolutely vital biological rhythms, so-called circadian rhythms, on which animals and plants all depend. We are all keyed into the cycle of day and night produced by the rising and setting of the sun. And this has profound importance for every animal and plant on the planet, except those in the deep ocean that are where light doesn't reach. We humans are also affected, and it's now been demonstrated in research that artificial light can increase the likelihood of people developing obesity, depression, sleep disorders, diabetes, and even some cancers. So even if we didn't care about other animals, we might think about the bad effects that light pollution has on ourselves. But there is, of course, another aspect to artificial light and light pollution, which is that it is fantastically wasteful. About 30% of outdoor lighting in the United States is wasted in the sense that it achieves no useful effect. And a recent estimate suggested that that cost more than $3 billion a year, or the equivalent of more than 20 million tons of CO2. So there are implications here, not just of a budgetary nature, money that can be saved, but also very important environmental considerations that have to do with climate change and CO2. But now the good news. Of all the environmental problems that we face, probably Alan is the easiest one to sort out. It's extraordinarily easy to turn lights off. It's also possible to shield them better. If lights are really needed outside at night, they can be shielded so that the light goes down rather than up into the sky. It's also possible to adjust the color temperature of light, because it's been shown that the more blue the light is, the more difficulty and damage it causes to animal life. So lights that have a more yellow or orange color are much better than the very bright white blue lights. And again, that's something that can easily be fixed. So of all these environmental problems that we're faced with, Alan is probably one of the easiest to fix. The problem we face is that most people still aren't seriously aware of it. And it is unfortunately a growing problem, and one that really does need to be addressed urgently. Well, what can we do? I myself happen to be involved currently in a very small campaign to reduce the levels of light over a military base in the middle of Chichester Harbour, and I've been making some progress, I'm glad to say. I'm also involved with the charity Bug Life, who've been working very, very hard in lobbying for the inclusion of some provisions relating to light pollution in the forthcoming Environment Bill. So watch this space. But apart from taking direct action, there are lots of other things you can do. For example, you could lend your support to the International Dark Skies Association, which is a US-based not-for-profit organization that does really outstanding work in bringing the problems of light pollution to the attention of policymakers and lawmakers, and indeed providing certificates to neighborhoods and towns that have introduced really effective provisions to control light pollution. And maybe, I mean, in closing, let me just say, I think possibly this is something the Guild might want to take an interest in, because at the moment, very, very few organizations in the UK, apart from Bug Life, are actively campaigning to do something about the problems of light pollution. So maybe our founder would approve of that. I think he probably would. So there's something to think about. Thank you all for listening.
Lovely, thank you, David. And a nice challenge there to be thinking about future activities on the part of the Guild and future initiatives. And certainly light pollution is something that affects us all. So with that note, we're going to now turn to a slightly more general discussion about pollution. And so I'm turning over to Chris Baines, who I see is now officially a co-host on this Zoom meeting. And so Chris, over to you.
Thank you. I will attempt to share my screen. Hang on. This is always the horrible moment. Well, fascinating. There's so much I'd like to come back at the previous two speakers about, but just as a kind of taster, I've been president of something called the Thames Estuary Partnership for the last 30 years. And one of the very good news stories environmentally is that although the Thames was biologically dead 70 years ago, it now has, for instance, harbour porpoises living around the House of Commons in the water there, and 120 odd species of fish. So in terms of the kind of chemical pollution, the sewage in the river and so on, the Thames is actually a rather good news story. But the issue of light pollution and noise pollution are two that I think have been very largely overlooked. And it's interesting that the Thames Estuary is a really significant entry point for migratory birds, entry and exit point. And if you are there very early in the morning when the lights are mostly off, and you listen carefully and the noise has disappeared, you will hear at this time of year redwings and fieldfares flying over London, and they're following the dark route along the Thames estuary. And one small success that I was a part of was in managing to stop floodlighting for a sports centre in Barnes that would have put a light block across one of the dark corridors that branches off the Thames and across to Wimbledon Common. So the issue of light pollution, I think, is a really important part of what we now need to address. What I'm going to be talking about, I'm very conscious of the fact that there are many people amongst you who know far more about Ruskin than I do. But I just thought it would be worth spending a few minutes talking about how valuable his kind of view of the world would have been over that last 70 or 100 years and would be now. And particularly, I think his great powers of observation of nature and his ability to inspire an artistic response. Those two things are the things that I really want to talk about. And I was struck by this portrait, which is very familiar to all of you, and would have been absolutely certain that the dippers would have been on this stream in the Trossachs had he stood there while he was being painted. But of course, as you probably all know, he wasn't stupid enough to stand there being eaten to bits by midges. Instead, he was painted in a studio in London. But
Chris, can I just... I'm so sorry. Can I just interrupt to say that at the moment you're not sharing your screen, or we're not seeing it. We're seeing you.
Ah, you poor things. Let me just have another go then. Can you?
Yes, that's good. If you
see me now?
Yes,
good.
If you start your slideshow now, then that will...
Great, good. You haven't missed much. Okay. Right.
Great. Thank you.
The point I was making was that Ruskin would have been observing, I'm quite sure, the dippers on that stream in the Trossachs had he been there, because he was a great observer of the detail. And it's in much of the detail that we pick up the messages about pollution. His famous painting of lichens, for instance. Lichens are one of those groups of organisms that actually is now known to be a very clear indicator of air quality. So as an observer of nature, I think he would have been picking up on those chronic changes, those gradual shifts that are such a feature of the effects of pollution. And maybe he would have been the person writing Silent Spring had he been around at that time. We know that he was very conscious of the kind of physical ugliness of pollution, and his whole initiative to clean up Carshalton ponds as a response to his mother dying was just a classic example, I suppose, of practical conservation dealing with pollution that was very visual. Whether he would have been as aware as we are now of the kind of the remote elements of pollution, the impacts of remote agricultural pollution on urban rivers, for instance, the hidden side of pollution, that's something which I think has been really quite late in our understanding of the environment, but it's absolutely central, I think, now to the way in which we need to deal with pollution issues. There is no point going to the point of damage. We have to go to the source of the pollution to try and address that. And one of the very obvious things to say is that he died before the great agricultural revolution. I trained as a horticulturist in the 1960s, and I always say that I spent 3 years at university being taught how to kill everything. That agricultural revolution started at the end of the Second World War and was very much a mechanical revolution and a chemical revolution. And that has had a huge impact. And the insects that we were just hearing about have declined spectacularly in the countryside, very largely as a result of that level of industrialized pollution. I always remember that as a little boy, I used to occasionally be treated to drives in my granddad's car into the countryside of Derbyshire. And one of my jobs was to keep getting out of the car and scraping the squashed insects off the headlamps. Well, that hasn't happened for 40 years, I would guess. So the pollution is having that knock-on effect on the wider natural world, but it's remote and it's not obvious to people. And the loss that he would have observed and that now is very familiar to conservationists like me has been gradual. So this kind of quality of hay meadow, for instance, full of wildflowers, something like 97, 98% of that quality of habitat has gone from the British farming landscape, thanks to intensification of agriculture. And this photograph, I had to go to Romania to get this quality of hay meadow into a little enclave that survived the agricultural pollution revolution. And as a consequence, of course, if you lose the plants, if you lose the habitat, then you lose the butterflies and you lose many of the species that we regard as a quintessential part of the wider, wilder landscape. And Ruskin, I think, would have been astonished to see the cornfields now that are completely devoid of all the cornfield wildflowers that were major pollutants in their way of the crop. And certainly there's corncockle in the foreground of that picture, purple flower, which is, its seeds of which are poisonous. So having corncockle growing in your corn crop wasn't necessarily a brilliant thing, but the fact that we have lost almost the entirety of that flora thanks to the pollution from agrochemicals is really a pretty astonishing achievement in post-war Britain. The modern day kind of much more visual pollution is absolutely in your face. You can't avoid it. And one of the things that I think we need Ruskin's kind of imagination to begin to deliver is something which really finds ways of making that more relevant and draws attention to it. It's so ubiquitous now that people take it for granted that you're going to clear up the rubbish every day from your local landscape and it will be back the following morning. In my little enclave within Wolverhampton, 2 or 3 people pick litter every single day and post a picture of what they've picked up, and the next day it's exactly the same. Well, one of the things that I thought you might be inspired by is this. This is an installation by an artist called Alexander Duncan. It was a part of the City of Culture in Hull 2 or 3 years ago. It looks like a big pile of rubble until you actually look at the detail of it. And that rubble is entirely made up of sea-washed lumps of plastic. And that kind of brilliance, it seems to me, is not very evident. And I think Ruskin would have been someone who would have found ways of celebrating, of teasing out that kind of creativity, just to strengthen the messages that need to be strengthened. There are 1 or 2 examples to inspire. This is an interesting new startup in Cornwall, a company called Waterhaul, that is taking the abandoned fishing nets that are a major part of the marine pollution problem and converting them into sunglasses and into, rather imaginatively, litter picking equipment. So there are nice examples, I think, of creative people beginning to address the problems of pollution in more imaginative ways, but we need very, very much more of that. And finally, I just wanted to talk about just the conundrum that we're dealing with. The huge increase in the number of offshore wind farms is one of the ways in which we're going to address the problems of carbon emissions and the carbon-based pollution that we've been hearing about. But of course, they're another kind of pollution. They're a visual pollution and not to everybody's liking. But my work is very much about trying to weave unholy alliances together. That's very much what the Thames Estuary Partnership was set up to try and achieve. And one of the things that has emerged in the debate about the sea and the marine environment is how significant, for instance, seagrass is as a community of plants that has the capacity to trap and hold some of those plastics and keep them out of harm's way, but also to capture carbon. And now we're beginning to see a debate about whether the wind farms could also be the basis for recovery of the seabed, and the place where we might actually foster new kelp forests, and a realization that the kelp forests and the seagrass have greater capacity to capture carbon than the tropical rainforests do. And as an island nation, we have a huge explosion in the number of wind farms predicted, but we also have a huge opportunity, I think, to use those as the way of working with nature to restore and rebuild and filter and clean pollution. And mussel beds and oyster beds are some of the most effective filters of marine and water-based pollution. So there is now an interesting conversation going on between the engineers who are developing more and more efficient wind power and the seabed conservationists who see this as an opportunity perhaps to restore and rebuild the damaged ecosystems below sea level. And what better than to actually think about that being a means by which we might sustain the small local businesses that would have absolutely have been on Ruskin's agenda. What nicer than to sit down to a plate of fruit de mer that you know has been delivered as a part of the cleanup of the seabed in the context of a renewable energy installation. That's how optimistic I can be. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. And it's nice to be able to end with a smile in the midst of us discussing pollution, which is such a darkening thing. But I have to admit that plate of fruits de mer has brought a smile to my face. So.
Good.
So we have about 5 minutes in theory, but we started a little bit late. So we have, in my mind, about 10 minutes for a bit of a conversation together. I think I'd like to begin by inviting our speakers, if there's anything they particularly would like to say or address in relation to each other, to start us off, but to also then throw it open to the floor. And in terms of the floor, probably the easiest way to know if somebody wants to chat is if you put something in the chat function saying that you have a question, or even write the question in it if that's useful for you to do. And either Simon or I can read out questions as well. So our speakers, thank you for a stimulating set of papers and reflections. And I'm wondering, is there anything you would like to say in response to each other or making connections across?
I have a question for David. What do you make of the illuminated river installation? I know you tried hard to avoid light spill, but are you concerned about it?
Are you talking about the Archangel installation?
No, the illuminated river, the Leo Villarreal 11 bridges illuminated in London?
I actually don't know about that. I've been skulking at home.
I'll send you a link afterwards.
But
I know quite a bit.
Bad. It sounds bad.
Well, I was very concerned about it when I first heard about it. Sarah Gaventa, you probably know, is the person who is driving it or leading it. And she was responsible for a government agency called CABE, the Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment, which the present government closed down almost as soon as it arrived.
And privatised.
But what's interesting is that I had a very early conversation with Sarah about my concerns for light pollution. I mentioned bird migration, but fish migration is also critically important. And many of the species in the Thames have to migrate between the fresh water at the top end and the seawater at the bottom end. And light pollution is a really significant factor for them. I think overall that the Illuminated Bridges program has actually put much more thinking into the process than has been done before. I think they've had some success in persuading the local authorities on the ends of the bridges to switch off lighting in the middle of the night, for instance, which nobody else seems to have taken that kind of initiative before. And they have put a great deal of effort into the kind of technical detail of the directional lighting and so on. So I think overall, my argument would always be that we need a better conversation between really quite disparate people and individuals and organizations, and far better to have those lighting engineers in a conversation about fish migration than they would ever had before, I guess. But it's more light pollution, and the River Thames is always going to be highly lit, I guess. It's inescapable.
Thank you, Chris. I see David has his hand up, and I've now got screen view where I should be able to see if people put their hands up as well. So David, back to you.
Picking up on what Chris has just said, I very much agree with him. I think with light pollution, the main problem is ignorance. People just, first of all, they don't realize what they've lost. And secondly, they don't realize how easy it is to fix all of this. I mean, I won't say that the problems can always be fixed, but in many, many cases, there are easy solutions. And I think a campaign of kind of public education would take us a long way.
I think there's an opportunity here as well to celebrate the few dark skies that we do still have. David mentioned that whole dark skies program, and there's also a wonderful tranquility program as well, which CPRE leads on. And maybe there's a role there for webcams that could actually show people from the comfort of their highly lit homes what they're missing. Because actually what they're missing is just breathtaking when you see it. I'm speaking to you from the shores of the Conway estuary on the edge of Snowdonia, and the contrast between here and the middle of Wolverhampton, where I spend the rest of my life, is very striking, partly because I can hear curlews in the background here, and they're a bit of a rarity in the middle of Wolverhampton, but also because I have something approaching a dark sky here, and it's magical.
And Ruskin used to write about the magic of the curlew's cry, so there you go.
It didn't help the curlews in the end. The decline is spectacular.
So would anybody else like to come in? Speakers have had a chance now to respond to each other, and it would be great to hear from others in the audience if anyone would like to add. So we have some experts who you can quiz, but also very much welcome your thoughts about pollution. Nicholas Friend. Oh, I think you're muted. Yes.
Thank you. Yes. My point is just responding to David's excellent talk with regard to light pollution. I used to live in an Oxfordshire village, and a group of my friends got together a petition against pollution in the village. This is extremely microcosmic, but it did throw up one or two quite interesting responses on those who were antagonistic to the idea that the streetlights in the village should be extinguished. And their argument was that if you extinguish streetlights, it encourages crime. And we did a bit of research and discovered that in fact, the opposite is true, that if you do not have streetlights, criminals are too frightened to visit your village. That's all I wanted to say.
May I respond very briefly? Nick, I'm very glad you raised that point. I should have mentioned this because crime always comes up when reduction in lighting levels is discussed. And you're absolutely right. All the research suggests that artificial light is really not helpful. Apparently, burglars, for example, would much prefer to attack a well-lit house because they don't have to turn on their torches, their flashlights, which of course gives the game away, and so on. I think there are issues around safety, people walking alone down dark alleyways and streets, especially in the light of recent horrific events. So, there probably are places where light is needed, but it's always possible to have it on a motion activation basis. So it's not necessarily kept on all the time. And crucially, of course, it can be shielded so that it doesn't spill everywhere.
Thank you.
As we get near our end time, there are two people who have things they'd like to say. Shall we start with Matthew Tattersalls question that's now come into the chat for everybody. And then I'm minded to hand over to Mark Cleaver to pull us to a close. Mark is our sort of new director for issues around environmental planning and the Guild and so on. And so as we begin to draw to a close, I see Matthew's question, and I'm not sure if everybody can read it, says, a lot of Ruskin biographies suggest, perhaps not in agreement with Ruskin's own diaries, that Ruskin had something of a distaste for darkness and that he wouldn't go out. Is Ruskin's worldview less about the perceived virtue of light versus dark and more about the pleasing separation of absolutes, as per creation in the Genesis account? Now, I don't know whether anybody would like to respond to that. Because to my mind, I'm not entirely sure which of the biographies suggest that Ruskin had a distaste for darkness or didn't like to go out in the dark. And I'm not sure whether that's ringing a bell to anybody else or not. But certainly some symbolic, I see Clive has his hand up. So Clive, did you want to say something in response to that? Oh, you're muted, Clive.
The person who said that was, I think, John Rosenberg in The Darkening Glass. I mean, he connects it with Ruskin's curious and inexplicable hatred of Rembrandt.
But some of his photos are very dark too.
Yeah. What Rosenberg talks about is the way Rembrandt's paintings are sort of predominantly dark, and there's a center of light in the painting, and that Ruskin seems to have often reacted against that sort of structure. Anyway, I just was asked, so I thought I would mention it. Can I also raise another point myself, Rachel? One of the things that's come out is, can I say, I thought those were 3 magnificent talks. I mean, really wonderful. Yeah. And terrific contribution to the work we all want to be doing. And it does seem to me we need to have some conversation about what part the Guild can play in issues of this sort, because clearly it can't play any sort of executive role, but an enabling role would be tremendously good. And I guess in a sense, that's partly what Peter is trying to organize in Venice to some extent. But I'd just like to say how much I would support something of that sort. Thank you.
Thank you, Clive. So can we then begin to draw towards a close with Mark Cleaver? So Mark, over to you.
Thank you, Rachel. I'd just like to say thank you very much to everybody for the great talks. I concur with Clive, really fascinating and illuminating, perhaps. My role is a new, or my involvement as a director is a new one, and my responsibilities, I suppose, if you can put it that way, is around climate and the environment and the rural economy. And so I'm both from a career perspective very interested in these issues, and obviously they will play a key part of what I'm going to be doing for the Guild over the next for the coming years. There's a couple of really interesting things I'd like to draw out from those 3 talks. I think the first one really is about the importance of questioning, the importance of criticality, the importance of really delving deep into what's going on, because without that critical questioning, we're going to find it very difficult to meet these challenges. Not just simply those where there is deliberate exclusion or deliberate hiding of information, but as Chris said, the importance of bringing these unholy alliances together of people who would not normally work together. An example of light pollution and the attempts by local authority highway departments, for example, to tackle some of the challenges of energy consumption by using LED lighting in street lights. Our latest research is showing that actually the wave frequency of some of these LED lights is more harmful to the insects and is having a negative impact on bats. So even with the right intentions, without the right people in a conversation, without that broader stakeholder engagement that we haven't been able to do in the past, or we haven't done in the past because of that siloed working mentality that we are drawn into, we need, we're at risk of creating a different set of challenges for the future. So it's really important for everybody, no matter who they are, to look at the changes that are happening around them, to be asking those questions, to be bringing their expertise and their knowledge from a different perspective. So it's great to hear that that's being done in some very unlikely, from some very unlikely quarters. The conversation on litter is one that's close to my heart, having litter picked many streets and nature reserves and parks and gardens, and having some responsibility for it now at a county council level, in that there are many brilliant projects out there looking at litter, but so many of them are end of pipe solutions, dealing with waste when it's been recovered rather than dealing with preventing waste in the first place. And there are so many opportunities for us to do that, not just in terms of some of the big campaigns we see around packaging, but some of the things that we do ourselves in our own homes. And I'm going to give one rather contentious example, I suppose, of that in dog ownership. Now we are bombarded by risks of or the concerns of livestock farming, cattle particularly. The cattle herd is around 1 million in the UK, 10 million in the UK, and that's been in decline since around the 1980s and is around the same level as somewhere between the 1920s and 1940s, and is continuing in decline. Now, whilst they have very different problems, we have around 10 million dogs in the UK, and the amount of dog waste that is left on our streets, pavements, parks and gardens that are full of some really nasty bacteria, pathogens, veterinary medicines that essentially damage our environment, that is almost the level of discussion is almost nil by comparison to some of the other issues out there, and they are the things that we can do ourselves and resolve ourselves very quickly and very easily. So one of the big challenges, I think, for us is to continue with that critical thinking and the critical look about everything we do ourselves and in other areas, and see where we can make changes and make and do away with pollution in ways which perhaps we haven't really given enough thought. So I'm really, I really enjoyed the 3 talks today. I think they've been brilliant, and I hope to continue with in my work, both for the Guild and my professional work, to continue in the same vein in challenging everything we do to reduce some of these problems. So thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it.
Good. Thank you, Mark. And we are getting towards our absolute cutoff time. So can I ask you to join me in thanking actually everyone who's participated tonight, including yourselves, for being here. Now, I know applause doesn't really work in our Zoom meetings, but imagine yourselves applauding in thank you to our speakers who've all really encouraged us to think about that critical thinking, that individual responsibility, and ways in which we can individually make a difference but also begin to try to think about ways that as a guild we might come together to magnify that difference that we can make as individuals. So thank you, everyone. And I look forward to our next time of coming together. As I said at the beginning, we are launching a new program focused on Venice, sort of as a microcosm, and Venice as Venice, but Venice as symbolic for the whole world as well. So encourage you to begin to join us for those as they start in December, if I remember right, led by Peter Berman and Clive Wilmer taking the steer on that set of sessions. So thank you, everyone, and looking forward to the next time.